Good morning. I'm Jeremy Barker, the director of the Religious Freedom Institute's Middle East Action Team. We thank you for joining this webinar today. The mission of the Religious Freedom Institute is to achieve a broad acceptance of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, a source of individual and social flourishing, the cornerstone of a successful society, and a driver of national and international security. And we do that in a number of ways through research and education programs. And one of those is a series of webinars that our Middle East and Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team are hosting on the relationship between Islam and the state in the Muslim majority world. And so this is the second in that series. And joining me in this is the director of RFI's Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team, Ismail Royer. Ismail, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. So yes, I'm director of the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team, and we're really excited for this, our second series in the webinar. I've been at RFI for about 2.5, almost 3 years now, I think. And this webinar is part of a series in which, actually a broader series where we've been doing in-person live consultations with Islamic scholars and non-Muslim scholars, focused on understanding the scope of religious freedom within Islam. And we did our first of the series in Rome. We did another consultation at Pepperdine University in California, and our next one is scheduled for Sarajevo. But during this period of COVID lockdown, we decided to do this series as a webinar to lead up to the Sarajevo event. Jeremy, why don't you introduce Osman Softic, our colleague in Sarajevo?
Yeah, so Osman Osman is our colleague, an academic and journalist based in Sarajevo. Osman, thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ismail. Good to be with you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And as Ismail mentioned, these webinars are part of this broader consultation series that's looking at the core underlying principles that make up religious freedom and how those are understood in different traditions, both historically and looking at both the principles, but historical case studies as well as, and then their contemporary issues. And part of the reason that the consultation scheduled to take place in Sarajevo is because the Bosnian experience really has a lot to contribute to this discussion. And so, Osman, we really appreciate the perspective that you're bringing to these events from both your scholarship, but also the lived experience you have there in Sarajevo.
Thank you, Jeremy. I would like to thank the RFI for actually making decision to hold this very important consultation in Sarajevo. Obviously, as the saying goes, we dream and plan, and the God is the one who decides for us. So obviously, this, as you mentioned, will have to be postponed for some other time in the near future. However, I think you are right. Bosnia and Sarajevo in particular, as it is called Jerusalem of Europe, or at least Jerusalem of the Balkans, I think it has a lot to offer, because the people of Bosnia and this region have lived for centuries in cohesion and cooperation, some periods of conflict and discord as well, but there were minor, very short periods of conflict. So I think traditionally Bosnia, although it's a small and insignificant country in terms of wealth and technological advancement and so on, but in a cultural terms, and I think intellectually and particularly in a religious field as well, it can offer some perspective that could be beneficial for the rest of the world, I think, irrespective of the small size and the general role that Bosnia plays in the world. And obviously also, and I always emphasize this fact, that the Bosnia and Herzegovina is perhaps one of the most successful examples, and I always talk about it to my friends and colleagues and from overseas, that where the international humanitarian intervention has really given a positive result, where we have dividend of peace. And for the last 3 decades, we've had this democratic society, although very imperfect and with a lot of difficulties and challenges, but still the conflict hasn't returned. The people-to-people relations are good, and I think it is progressing, albeit slowly, quite positively for a brighter future.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Bosnia is a goldmine of cultural and religious and historical achievements, and we hope to explore. We will be exploring that in much more depth in future webinars. Jeremy, so we are waiting now for Dr. Recep Şentürk to call in. He's indicated to us that he's going to be a little bit late. Do you want to introduce who he is and give us his biography and let the viewers know who he is?
Yep, so I'll give a brief introduction and then we'll have him join us. And then just before that, we'll have Ismail give us a bit of background on the first webinar and some of the points that Professor Greenfield made.
Okay.
Yeah, our guest today, joining us from Istanbul, is Professor Recep Şentürk, currently the president of Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. Professor Şentürk has degrees in theology and sociology from Marmara University and Istanbul University, and then his PhD from Columbia University. The author of a number of publications on topics related to what we'll be discussing today, has been the director of the Alliance of Civilizations Institute since its founding, and then for the last number of years, the president of Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. So very excited to bring Professor Şentürk into the conversation today. And so I'll go ahead and bring him in, and then Ismail, you can recap a few of the key points to start the conversation.
Okay.
Professor Şentürk, welcome.
My warmest greetings to all of you from Istanbul.
Oh,
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you for joining. We're glad to have you as a part of this conversation, and know that you have a number of things to contribute to this. So thank you as you're coming toward the end of your days, and we're starting it here in the US. We thank you for joining the conversation.
Yes. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this dialogue and conversation.
thank you. Thank you.
So Ismail, 2 weeks ago, we had Professor Greenfield on discussing the emergence of the nation state. Recap for us a few of the most salient points from that conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So first, I want to say we're very, very blessed to have Dr. Şentürk on, and we're really, really grateful. And it's amazing that we have on this webinar, we have Dr. Şentürk in Sarajevo. I mean, excuse me, in Istanbul, and we have Osman Softic in Sarajevo, and we have Jeremy in DC, and me in Pennsylvania. It's really an amazing thing. So in our last webinar, our first one, Dr. Leah Greenfield, who is an expert on, perhaps the greatest living expert on the nation state, on nationalism, he explained to us that there were no actual quote-unquote states in the pre-modern world as we understand them, because modern states are the product of national consciousness and the phenomenon of popular sovereignty, or the notion of popular sovereignty. And so she said, in that sense, although we often use the term state to refer to pre-modern political communities, strictly speaking, the term state is really refers to the contemporary phenomenon of nation states. So she further explained that national consciousness is today the dominant form of consciousness. That is the view that all that really matters is concentrated in this world, in the mundane, to the exclusion of the significance of the transcendental spheres. So in other words, that the nation and the state is the primary source of legitimacy, and therefore the people is the primary source of legitimacy, the primary source of sovereignty, and that this is a very new type of identity, she explained, that did not exist before nationalism was born in England in the 16th century and then spread to other parts of Europe. So prior to that, the world was, the political communities in the world tended to be either kingdoms or feudal polities or tribal, and whereas today the nation-state order has more or less spread throughout the world. And she explained also that with the notion of popular sovereignty, the notion that the people are the source of legitimacy, that God loses sovereignty in that situation, and God becomes much less important. And she explained that in modern times, religion has gone from being the legitimating factor of or the lodestone or the foundation of order. It has become a tool in the hands of the state in the pursuit of worldly. She explained that our relation to that the state, in fact, has almost taken the place of God Himself, and that our relationship to the state and in general to the nation is very similar to the pre-modern relationship between the individual and God Himself. And what was so interesting to us about this discussion of history is we're very interested in what the thesis of thinkers like Wa al-Halaq and Talal Asad and many others who have argued that as a result of all this, an Islamic state is in fact impossible, because the pre-modern Islamic polities and Islam itself can only fully, authentically be lived in a polity in which is fundamentally grounded in the transcendent and other structural features that follow from that, as opposed to the contemporary state, which is arranged in such a way, structurally and ideologically, as Dr. Greenfeld outlined, in a way that in fact is contradictory to Islam itself. And then, of course, the attendant things that came along with that, like the collapse of the Waqf system, the co-option of the ulama by the state, and so on. So we're very blessed to have Dr. Rajab Shenturk on, who is an expert in matters of statecraft and politics and history, to explain to us how this phenomenon that began in Europe, this ideological and structural phenomenon, began to spread and did in fact spread to the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire, whose seat was in Istanbul, where Dr. Shenturk is located, was it was dismembered, and its parts became nation states in the Muslim majority world. So what we'd like to begin with Dr. Shenturk is asking him, if he could, how did the nation state spread to the Muslim majority world, and crucially, what changed from the pre-modern order to the world nation state order that we have today?
Thank you. The pre-modern and modern statecraft in the Muslim world is very different. Most of the modern nation states in the Muslim world are installed by colonizers. they are products of nation building and state building, and that's why it would not be appropriate to compare rise of nations and states in the colonized regions in the world with the rise of nation states in Europe. So there are major differences. First of all, like what's nation, and is it appropriate to call like many of the states in the Muslim world nations? Let's say the Gulf states, tribal states, and like if you consider Arabs as a nation, so how many nations, how many nation states Arabs have today? Same thing for if Turks is a nation, then how many Turkish or Turkic states are there? So the concept of nation is a very problematic and contestable concept. What's a nation? How are you going to define it? Can we manufacture nations? Can we build nations? So there isn't an objective reality that can be objectively called nation. It is something crafted, built, and the state is built for it. Sometimes a state is built, then a nation created for that state. And sometimes, a nation is created, then a state is created for that state. So with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and also with the spread of colonization and European expansion, many states have been established by the colonizers in the formerly Ottoman lands, as well as in Africa and in Asia, in different parts, after they shared those regions, and they built nations, and then the states as well. So we have to be aware of these differences. But at the abstract level, if you compare the pre-colonial states in the Muslim world, by the way, Muslims always had states. It is like the medieval Islamic history is different than the medieval European history, because there was no feudalism in the Muslim world. So there were like big empires like Ottoman Empire, the Iranian Empire, and also in India the Mughal Empire. So there were like big empires and centralized governance in those regions. Those states, they collected taxes, from a very wide area. So it was not divided similar to the European feudal system. Even during the Abbasid period, there were small, governing bodies, but they were all connected to the Khalifa at the center. So the philosophy was different and structure was also different. We should always avoid essentializing Islamic State, the concept of Islamic State and Islamic, political philosophy. The terms used for a state in the traditional Islamic languages is dawla and also mulk. These are all terms that are used, and there are different genres, different literary styles in Islamic history about politics. For instance, politics and state is part of the theology, Islamic theology, because the Shia has its own doctrine about how a state should be established and how it should be run, what's the source of legitimacy. And the Ahl Sunnah has its own views and doctrines on it. So Shia emphasizes the lineage from Prophet Muhammad for the political legitimacy and authority, but Ahl Sunnah rejects that. And in Ahl Sunnah there is, the bay'at, the consensus or the consensual contract or agreement, between the leader or the authority and the subjects. It's more like contractual, more impersonalized understanding of it. So it's part of the ilm kalam, and also in fiqh, it's also very important. And both in fiqh and ilm kalam, it is postulated that to live under political administration is obligatory for Muslims. Otherwise, they cannot fully practice their religion. For instance, like Friday prayer. For instance, today is Friday, right? So, I mean, you cannot a Friday prayer, in order to be legitimate, requires there to be a political authority, and this political authority gives permission, to hold Friday prayers, and this in fiqh, right? So fiqh assumes that in order for Islam to practice, there must be a state, a political authority. So there is kalam approach to politics, and there is fiqh approach to politics. And also people like Ibn Khaldun, their approach to politics is more empirical. And for instance, Ibn Khaldun says that al-mulku daririyun shar'an wa aqlan. State is necessary rationally as well as religiously. I mean, religion tells us that state is necessary. You cannot live without state. And also, reason tells us that you cannot live without the state. You must have the state. So Muslim thinkers, historians or people who may be called social scientists, who looked at the issue not from fiqh or theology perspective, they also postulated that the state is necessary. I mean, human beings cannot continue without state. So Ibn Khaldun says that Sharia requires people to have a state, religiously necessary, but at the same time, security, in order for people to live in security, requires them to have a state, and also their economic needs. They cannot meet their economic needs. So this security argument is very common in the Western political thought as well, and this economic argument also, division of labor and meeting the needs is also very common. But there is something unique to Ibn Khaldun. He says that uns, I mean, the friendship and socialization is another need, like peaceful socialization, friendship among people is also a very important need that cannot be met without existence of state. So this is more like a social psychological need, for people to live in friendship and fellowship with each other, because you may be very safe, and all your needs may be provided, but if there is no friendship, if there is no socialization, you wouldn't be happy. So he also sees this as a need for the establishment of a state. and he very interestingly talks about asabiya as a source of authority and legitimacy. And asabiya is a very important concept because it is very similar to what you said. I mean, the popular source of authority as people, you know. So he says, if there is no asabiya, no political legitimacy, no state. You know, you cannot have a state without asabiya. I mean, the collective solidarity or collective consciousness. You know, so this the concept of asabiya is a multidimensional concept. It has social psychological dimension and the political dimension, cultural dimension, religious dimension. And Ibn Khaldun explains rise of every state with the concept of asabiya. You know, he says without asabiya you cannot have a state, and asabiya is the cement that brings people together, ties them together as a single group under one political authority, and it makes people to accept the legitimacy of that authority above them. And so the concept of asabiya, you know, is part of Islamic political thought as well, and it was taken into consideration. And there is also something very interesting from Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun drew the image of state as a circle. You know, I make in my classes on states and politics, I ask students to draw image of state. You know, so I mean, we can make a test here also. You know, like ask you draw image of state. Like how? I mean, if you know, I ask you to draw image of state, what would you draw? So sometimes, you know, students draw some like very interesting things, but most of them draw pyramids. Pyramid, right? Because this is the modern understanding of state. But Ibn Khaldun drew a circle, you know, a circle with 8 components, you know, with 8 components, and he called it Dairatu Siyase, circle of politics. You know, circle of politics. There are 8 elements in that circle. You know, there is you know, head of the state, and there is subjects, there is economy, there is army, you know, there is a justice system. So 8 components which make the state. And guess where is the head of the state? You may think it's at the center. No, the center is empty. You know, I mean, head of the state is one of the components among the 8 components. So this is something very interesting and very shocking. So from Ibn Khaldun perspective, if you look at the process of modernization, you know, it is a new asabiya. You know, it's a crafted asabiya. Whether it is crafted indigenously or by the intervention of the colonizers, you know, it's an attempt, you know, to create some popular legitimacy for a new state. But at the same time, more importantly, it's a transition from circular understanding of state to pyramid understanding of the state, because nation state, modern nation state, is built on a pyramidical understanding of political authority. So the subjects, the people is in the at the bottom, and then the ruling class at the top. So they vote once in a while, you know, to elect their rulers, but they are subjects. And in the modern literature, the state is always depicted, illustrated as a pyramid. But so this is a transition, I think, from a circular model of politics to the pyramid-like understanding of politics. And Ottomans applied Ibn Khaldun's theories, especially this circular state model, and they called it daire adliye. Daire adliye means the circle of justice. Same concept, but they call it circle of justice instead of circle of politics, because the Ottoman political thought was result-oriented. So politics is process, justice is outcome, the result. So the goal of this circular system is to produce justice. So that's why they call it the circle of justice, referring to the expected outcome of the system. But Ibn Khaldun called it circle of politics, referring to the process, because there is this process. Yeah. So this is how I see the shift, the transition from the pre-modern understanding of state to the modern understanding of the state. Of course, there are other dimensions of it. We can explore it through your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Şentürk. You've mentioned so much there that requires a lot of unpacking. The first thing I wanted just to mention for viewers is that when you're using the terms, previous webinar would see that Dr. Greenfeld wanted to make a distinction between, or she wanted to say that she wanted to specify the term state as a contemporary phenomenon. And I think some of the words that you are using, like dawla or mulk are not necessarily state in the contemporary sense, but they refer more to like.
I disagree with this. Because this is essentializing modern concept of state and universalizing it. So this is a very narrow perspective. People always had states, but different types of states. So you cannot say, I have this model of state, and if there are other models, I don't accept them as states. So state means political authority and governance, and throughout history, people always developed many different models, like a Chinese state, Indian state, Roman state, Muslims, and medieval Europe and Europe. So we cannot say modern nation state is the only state model. I mean, you can say modern nation state did not exist before modernity.
Right.
Of course, it wouldn't exist because it's a modern phenomenon.
Right.
But people had other types of institutions and arrangements, to serve the same goals.
Yes, no doubt. I'm just referring to like the terminology that she was using. But yes, no question there. So you mentioned, and I read in your paper that that you sent us discussing Ibn Khaldun's circle of politics and how the Ottomans adopted that and had a sort of the circle of justice, and contrasting that with the contemporary notion of the pyramid, and you critiqued modern or contemporary like Islamist thinkers and conceptualizing or let's say like assuming this premise, assuming this model of governance, and failing to look back to Ibn Khaldun and the Ottoman Empire's understanding of the of politics or governance as a circle. I thought that was really fascinating. I wanted to ask you, what is the structurally, what is the difference? after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, after the consolidation of these nation states across the Muslim world. And by the way, you mentioned it was a very important point that many of these nation states are actually not really nation states. Are more states that are trying to that are not necessarily with nations. But the ideology or the aspiration is nevertheless there to sort of to have a state. That's sort of what has become the norm. And so what is the difference in terms of, say, the Waqf, which was a critical part of pre-modern societies, that those were tended to be nationalized either by the colonizing powers or by the successor governments to the empire, Ottoman Empire. You have the Waqf, you have the co-option of the ulama, which began in the late Ottoman Empire, but was consolidated and carried on by the successor states. What has been the effect of those processes? Also, one other thing I'll mention, but the end of the millet system where you had a sort of legal pluralism, and in the contemporary modern state, legal pluralism is sort of anathema, even though it, to some extent, you have some vestiges, some leftover resemblances of that. But so between these, for example, three phenomena: collapse of the millet system, collapse of the Waqf system, which collapse the co-option of the ulama by the state. What has been the effect of that on the Islam, of the way that Islam is understood, practiced, and for that matter, for minorities, religious minorities?
Yes, one of the very important dimension of the transition from the pre-Islamic statecraft to the nation state in the Muslim world is elimination of civil society completely. Those nation states that were installed or built in the Muslim world, they crushed civil society organizations because they wanted to control the society completely without any potential rivals against them. So Waqf is part of civil society in the Muslim world because Waqf is established by an initiative from society, and it's financed by society, by civil society, and the Waqf decides what to do itself, not on orders from the state. So they, the leaders of the nation states or the ruling class, they saw this as a threat because it was not controlled by the state. Financing was not from the state, and they did not get the orders what to do, from the states. So in order to have the society as a whole under their control, they destroyed the Waqf system. And with the fall of the Waqf system, ulama also fell because Waqf financed the ulama, because ulama was not financed by the state historically. Ulama had their financing coming from the Waqf. So this gave autonomy and relative independence, from the state to the ulama, and also the madrasa system, the education system was also financed by the Waqf system. So ulama was also part of the civil society, and the same way Sufi orders, they were also closed down. Let's say in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey, they were outlawed because a Sufi order is an independent organization.
Yeah.
the Sufi sheikhs, they are not appointed by the states, and they generate their own financing, and their membership does not depend on state approval. So it's an independent civil society organization. So modern nation states, they did not like that type of civil society organization. And the same thing for the millets, the minority groups. Those millets, they were minority groups, and they were organized among themselves under a religious head, like a Jewish millet, Orthodox millet, Armenian millet, and they followed their religious head. But the modern nation state, ruling class, they did not like this either, because they wanted to subjugate and establish total control on every group in society. So they fought Waqf, they fought ulama, they fought Sufi orders, and they fought millet system. And when in the process of modernization, Christian minorities, Jewish minorities did not like this secularization, because they were aware that in the process of secularization they will lose their autonomy and freedom. So that's why, for instance, there is a Christian scholar called Sava Pasha. So he's the first one who wrote a fiqh book defending fiqh. Can you imagine a Christian defending fiqh, defending Sharia? Why? Because Sava Pasha, he knew if Ottomans abolish Sharia, and millet system will be abolished, and the Christians will lose their relative autonomy under the state. So everything revolves around eliminating civil society and civil society organizations, so that nation state can establish total control over society. But this was very consequential in the progress of society and democratic participation, and also social peace. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Şentürk, great to be with you in this fascinating conversation. You mentioned Ibn Khaldun. Obviously, there is a lot of symbolism. You're heading the university which carries the name of this famous Muslim scholar. My question to you is, do you think that the current crisis that the Muslim world generally is going through, and it's been going through it for many decades, could be overcome by reimagining or learning from Ibn Khaldun from the beginning, to reimagine his thought? Because as historians like, for instance, Albert Hourani, who studied the Arab world, quite a serious authority, he mentioned that the Arab world experimented with not only secularism but liberalism as well in the 1930s. And then after that came the period of this national awakening through socialist thought, especially in Syria and Egypt, and then Pan-Arabism, and the Christian scholars obviously played an important part in it, like Syrian and Michel Aflaq, for instance, together with Salahuddin Batar. But then again, the military juntas took over, and it seems to me that the Muslim world has had a really rough ride. Is it, do you think, because they haven't, the Muslim countries or Muslim peoples, particularly the Arab peoples, haven't learned from Ibn Khaldun and what he, to say, prophesied, so to speak, that other scholars in the West, like Edward Gibbon and in most recent time Paul Kennedy, discussed the rise and falls of civilizations and empires. Could we learn as of now, what can Ibn Khaldun and his thought teach us about reform and this asabiya, and how do you think that the Ibn Khalduns can direct the popular will of the Arab people towards the center, and how can they overcome the injustices, illegitimacy, and these crises that are caused by entrenched elites in the Muslim world, and the disenfranchised masses, as we've seen on the Syrian case, failed to accomplish this task of popular will and creating a more just and democratic society?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I am head of International Ibn Khaldun Society since 2006, and every 2-3 years we organize International Ibn Khaldun Symposium, where we discuss contemporary social, political, economic, and cultural questions from Khaldunian perspective. And our motto is applied Khaldunism. You know, we don't want a praise of Ibn Khaldun. You know, we don't want, reintroducing ideas of Ibn Khaldun. In these symposiums, we invite scholars to implement Ibn Khaldun's concepts and methods to analyze, one current issue, be it political, economic, social, or cultural, analyze it and demonstrate the advantages of using Khaldunian perspective, compared to the other existing alternatives. And we are attracting many scholars from around the world who are discontent, with the existing perspectives in social sciences, in politics, in economics, in history, sociology, etc. So I believe, and we argued that that Ibn Khaldun is not the precursor of modern social sciences, but it is the alternative of the modern social sciences. And our goal is to show that he is a good alternative through applied Khaldunism. So this is the best way to demonstrate that he provides an alternative, to the existing theories. So Ibn Khaldun is a good alternative to understand the world today as a whole, not just the Middle East. If you want to understand the Europe, America, Japan, Africa, you have to use Ibn Khaldun. And we have a very interesting research, trying to understand American society by using Ibn Khaldun, or European society by using Ibn Khaldun. And actually, there's a very interesting anecdote. Once there was a Sikh, with big turban. He came, to make a presentation, in Ibn Khaldun symposium. And all my colleagues, they said, "Who's this guy? What's he doing here?" I said, he's a Sikh from India. And he said, what's he doing here? I said, he's going to explain Indian economy by using Ibn Khaldun perspective. And they were all shocked. I told them, if he used one European economist perspective to analyze Indian economy, you wouldn't be surprised. Why are you so surprised? He's using Ibn Khaldun's perspective, to analyze the Indian economy, right? Because we all became Eurocentric in our understanding. So, like Ibn Khaldun society, is promoting Ibn Khaldun as an alternative, as a global alternative, to the existing positivist social sciences, because positivist social science is very reductionist. I mean, Ibn Khaldun has a more comprehensive approach. There is an empirical level in his analysis, but those who see this similarity between Ibn Khaldun's empirical perspective and some of the empiricist social scientists in the West, they say, "Whoa, he's the precursor of that guy." But I mean, how can you say Ibn Khaldun is a precursor for Marx? Either you don't know Ibn Khaldun or you don't know Marx. Read more carefully. How can you say Ibn Khaldun is a precursor of Auguste Comte? I mean, either you don't know Ibn Khaldun or you don't know Comte, because Ibn Khaldun's ontology is a multiplex ontology. It accepts that there is material world, and also there is metaphysical world, and there is divine world.
Yeah.
But Auguste Comte, Marx, these are materialists. They only accept one material level of existence. So how can you say these are the same people? And also Ibn Khaldun has multiplex epistemology. He sees empirical research as a source of knowledge, but at the same time rational thinking, as a source of knowledge, and also he accepts divine revelation as a source of knowledge. This is what I call, multiplex epistemology, and traditionally Muslim scholars called it maratibul wujud, maratibul ulum. And also Ibn Khaldun accepts the legitimacy of multiple methods, multiplex methodology, and this is called maratibul usul. Different methods. I mean, I can elaborate on these things, but it would take a long time. I'm just drawing your attention.
That was fascinating.
If we apply this Khaldunian multiplex perspective to modern society, be it Islamic or non-Islamic, I believe that we will be better off. For instance, now we have pandemic, and Ibn Khaldun talks in Muqaddimah about pandemic. And he says the big problem is that people during pandemic they try to maintain their previous habits. This is what makes them die, not the pandemic itself. Okay, they ignore that there's a new condition. They want to keep going on the same way. So he says, this is what kills them. Not the pandemic itself, because it's possible to protect yourself, from the pandemic. But if you think there is no pandemic and you want to keep going the same way as before, so now they are talking about new normal, right? So Ibn Khaldun, kind of reminds that when there is pandemic, you have to change your life because there is a new condition. So there are many things that we can learn from Ibn Khaldun, but most importantly, this concept of asabiyya, this popular sovereignty and people as a source of legitimacy, and also this circular governance. And I believe, nation state suffers, today from big problem. And I see that this pyramid-like structure is a big problem, and we need to reform our state system everywhere in the world, whether in America or in Europe or in the Muslim world. My proposal is that we have to shift to the circular state model, as proposed by Ibn Khaldun and as implemented by many different states, including Ottomans. But Ottomans is not the only one. It's the contribution of the circular understanding of state is that it's more egalitarian, and it allows participation, participation in the governance. And today, the problem with the political process is that some people are excluded from the political process, and they are alienated, and then they react either through terror or some other ways. So we need a more comprehensive, more egalitarian understanding of politics and political process to allow all segments of society to involve in politics. And asabiya, I think is something we need to really appreciate, especially during the process of pandemic, because social solidarity is very important, not only for the political process to function very well, but at the same time when you handle the crisis. So today we have a big crisis in the world, and we learn that no one is safe until everyone is safe in the world. Yeah. And this reminds us that individualism is not the best way to go. We need asabiya, we need solidarity, to help each other. So this is something that we can learn from Ibn Khaldun and apply today.
Dr. Şentürk, I know Jeremy has a question, but I wanted to ask you about the concept of asabiya and the relationship between that and the contemporary notion of popular sovereignty. So as I read Ibn Khaldun, he discussed asabiya almost in terms of which they translate in English as group feeling or group solidarity. He seemed to be discussing it. It seemed to me to be discussing it in terms of a pragmatic necessity. In other words, for example, he talked about the way that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was aided by the asabiya or the group feeling of the Arabs, and that the asabiya of the Arabs was an asset for the. And then likewise, the asabiya of the Persians and other let's say other peoples that played very important roles in the governance of the Muslim societies, that these were necessary, just in terms of pragmatic necessities to governance, as opposed to today with the concept of popular sovereignty as it sort of developed in the, at least in the West. The idea is that the people are the source of legitimacy. In other words, not just in a pragmatic sense, but almost in a sort of, reality. In other words, if the people do not, that the people are the ultimate source of sovereignty, which is I read it as somewhat different than just that sort of group feeling. What's your take on that?
Yes, yeah. So this is a very important comment. So Ibn Khaldun is not talking about what it should be,
right?
He's talking about what it is.
Exactly.
So he observes in reality, that if there is no group feeling to accept the legitimacy of a state, the state cannot survive.
Yes.
And he also warns against disintegration of the asabiya, due to individualism. So if you have individualism, then this asabiya may disintegrate, and as a result, this would have negative consequences on the survival of the state, because because those people who advocated for nationalism, they always used the concept of asabiya for nation building, because they said you cannot have a nation without the asabiya. I mean, like people sharing the same common identity, as a nation, and also the solidarity in the nation, and this seeing the in the modern Western political thought, they are talking about what it should be. So they are saying people should be the source of legitimacy.
Right, right.
Which I believe is a dream, never realized. Okay.
Yeah.
And they produce some mechanisms like voting, elections, etc.
Right.
And these are all debatable. Whether whether it's enough to have an election in 5 years, to have people vote, and then claim that people is sovereign, and they are the ones who are ruling.
Right.
I mean, it's a construction. I took theory of democracy from Sartori. He is a famous political theoretician. So Ibn Khaldun's perspective is more empirical. He's talking about what it is in reality, and the theories you are referring to, they are talking about actually it's a normative approach.
Normative, yeah.
How things should be.
Right.
I completely agree. I mean, the idea is very good.
Yeah.
I mean, people should be sovereign, but how are we going to realize it in practice? It's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I want to bring in a point you made earlier, but also one of the questions that we just got from one of the viewers related to kind of a decreasing in religious plurality in many Muslim majority countries. And this touches a little bit on one of the points you made in your opening remarks of, as states were formed following the collapse of the empire, some cases you had a state established, and then this process of creating a nation to be a part of that state. And whether we look at the Turkish experience, Egypt, Iraq, or others, this question of what is the nation and who belongs, and whether it's on ethnic divisions or religious divisions, and in the shift to more of a pyramid conception of the state, you have a administrative structure forcing a conception of identity onto the populace. And so what are some of the impacts of that, of kind of a top-down creation of a nation and the identity? And it has impacts, certainly we could look at religious minorities as one example, but even within the Muslim community, of a particular type of Muslim fits with the conception of a Turk. You can be a Turkish Muslim, but just a particular type, and others not. So how that kind of creating of national identity, as that's kind of forced down, what are the impacts of that? And then to that question of, as we look now, this kind of decrease in religious plurality, what do we do about it?
Yes, I see that today the biggest problem in the world is diversity management. Diversity is increasing in the world, in particular due to fast developing transportation and communication. So today we don't have homogeneous societies. Maybe a century ago, Europe was completely Christian, but today, in Europe there are Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, many different religions, and the same thing in America. It's no longer only a purely Christian country. So you have Muslims everywhere, but Christians in the Muslim world, and Buddhists everywhere, and other religions in Buddhist countries. So diversity is very much increasing, and I call this a new condition as open civilization. So today, civilizations have no borders, have no gates, have no windows, all civilizations, they are intermingled with each other, and in this conjecture, diversity management becomes the most important problem in the whole world today. I mean, you like we are now watching in the news that a black man was killed in America, and there's big problem. So this problem is a diversity management problem. Like you have blacks and you have whites. I mean, you need to manage them. You have to fairly administer them. And the same thing, like the problem of Islamophobia is another problem. And in the Muslim world, under the nation states, they did not know how to handle non-Muslim minorities. But traditionally, Islamic civilization was very successful in diversity management. I mean, what's New York, California, or Berlin, or London today was like Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Bukhara, Istanbul. These cities, they were very cosmopolitan cities. Christian, Buddhist, Hindu minorities, they all lived in these places. In particular, like people are very familiar with the Andalusian diversity management, Christian, Jews, Muslims living together, or Bosnian, or Ottoman. But people are less familiar with the India practice, because in India, Buddhists and Hindus, they lived under Islamic rule, and they were granted the same rights Christians and Jews were granted. And so I did research about this, why Muslims granted rights, in particular freedom of religion, to all religions. What's the philosophy or legislation or morality behind this? I came to discover that Islamic law and politics is based on a very key concept, and this concept is Adamiyya. And Adamiyya means Adamhood, or being a child of Adam. So in Islamic law, rights are granted to Adamiyya. So any child of Adam has rights, regardless of religion. So Hindus, they are Adami, Buddhists, Adami, and Zoroastrians in Iran worshipping fire, but they're also Adami. So they're all granted these basic fundamental rights. So this is a very universalistic perspective, and this is one of the things that we lost during the transition to the modern nation state, because modern nation states accepts citizenship based on very narrow perspective, and it accepts only positive rights granted by positive law to the citizens. But traditional Islamic law, Hanafi, Maliki, Hanbali schools, with the exception of the Shafi school, it requires more detailed discussion. I can explain it if you like. So these three schools accept that rights are granted to Adamiyya. Every human being, regardless of the race, regardless of the religion, have these rights: inviolability of life, inviolability of religion, inviolability of property, inviolability of honor, and family. So these rights are granted to the Adamiyya, and I have articles on these issues as well. So in the modern, in the process of modernization, Muslim political thought lost this universalism, because Muslim political thought imitated this national ideology and pyramid-like, understanding of politics. So Muslims need to regain, this universalistic understanding based on Ademiyya, and I believe this will really help in diversity management in the Muslim world. And also, Muslims are very well positioned in helping, Europe, America, and other parts of the world in diversity management, because Islamic civilization has a very rich legacy and experience in diversity management, and they built philosophy, morality of diversity management, both through kalam, fiqh, and also tasawwuf. The Sufi approach is also very important in respecting the other and diversity management. So it's very unfortunate that in the process of secularization and modernization, our ruling elites became alienated to any religion, both Muslim and non-Muslim, and they see a religious community as a threat to homogeneous national entity. So they try to homogenize them and subjugate them, and in the process, both Muslims and non-Muslims suffer.
Yeah,
that's exactly right, and it's something that not only is a need for a recovery of that concept of Adamiyya in the Muslim tradition, within Christianity, the idea of human dignity based in someone's being made in the image of God, grounded from Genesis 1, and that provides a universal principle that from that flow all of these other rights and values that come purely because of an anthropology of who every person is. And so that's critical to diversity management. And as RFI, we often think about this. That's one of the values that religious communities bring to bear on these questions of diversity management or social and political questions, is being able to bring that grounded anthropology to bear on these questions. So we're coming to the end of the time. Maybe bring in one final question from one of the viewers about, is there a future beyond the nation state for the Muslim majority world? I know for Osman and I, we plan to have a number of conversations asking that exact question, but a question we have today. So as you think through this, Professor Şentürk, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yes, there is a very striking passage in Peter Berger, this well-known, renowned sociologist of knowledge and religion. So he says that we now live in a condition, and we think this condition is forever. It will never come to end. But he says, look at history. People who lived in those historical periods, they also thought the same way. But history always keeps changing, and thinking that the modern condition in which we live is forever is rejected, by a simple observation of how history changed and how many periods took place in history. So our modernity, post-modernity, nation state, these things will all come to an end, but we cannot predict exactly when and how. But nothing is forever in this world. كل من عليها فان. Everything on this earth is temporary. This is what God reminds us. لكل أمة أجل. Every society, every community has an end. Nothing is forever. Of course, the nation state will also come to an end, and I am looking forward to it.
What would be the alternative to, we tend to think, Professor Şentürk, about nation state as a given, as end of history in itself. But one of my professors in Australia, Anthony Milner, from the Australian National University, one very well-known historian, once said, how about we reimagine the empires again, because there might be something to learn from this kind of political system of the past.
Yes, one of the things our modern educational system teaches us is modern arrogance. You know, we think all previous generations are stupid, they knew nothing, and we are the smartest people, you know, to live on the face of the earth. I mean, I believe this is you know, arrogance, and I agree with your professor that there are many things, you know, for us to learn from historical experiences of different civilizations, different religions, different nations. I mean, of course, past cannot be replicated today. It's a past. The Ottoman Empire is gone, Abbas is gone, Andalus is gone, Roman Empire is gone. But there are things that we can learn from them. In particular, we can learn this concept of Ademiyya, to build upon it a universalist, inclusive understanding of politics, law, and morality, and this is the common ground for all, you know, universalist ideologies and religions. You know, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, they are all based on this concept of Ademiyya. You know, their message is very much universal. So this concept of Ademiyya, I believe, is very important, and I hope that what should replace nation state should be a more inclusive system, an open civilization, you know, open to all religions, cultures, and ideas, based on a fair diversity management system. You know, and this diversity, you know, is very important, because nation states assumed that we can eliminate diversity.
Right.
Yeah. And this was a false expectation. It can never be realized, because it's dictation of nature and God. You know, God created us in a diverse way, and there is no way, you know, to turn us into robots or machines, you know, thinking the same way and feeling the same way. So we have to take as given that we are diverse, and, you know, creates an inclusive and fair diversity management. Otherwise, diversity would be a big source of problem, a clash and conflict. However, if diversity is managed well in a fair and just way, it will be a source of prosperity.
I love it.
Yeah. We have
for the future.
Yeah, I know we're nearing the end of our time. We had one good question that comes in that touches right on this. Let me bring it up. Of contrasting the idea of the millet and legal pluralism versus the more modern idea of universal human rights, which in a sense is maybe the sense, perhaps 1948, the attempt to get to a more inclusive society has been largely within this universal human rights structure or paradigm. Could you give us some of your thoughts on contrast, shortcomings, or otherwise within kind of universal human rights as at least applied, and getting towards the more open society that you just mentioned as the needed aim?
Yes. So millet system was developed as a tool of diversity management. You know, managing religious communities. So Muslims, they were called a millet. Christian, you know, every denomination, like Orthodox millet, Armenian millet, Jewish millet, and later, you know, Protestant millet, and Zoroastrian millet, Hindu millet, Buddhist millet. So this was a tool of diversity management. And members of these millets they were all given the fundamental right because based on the Ademiyya. So they all shared the same fundamental rights, inviolability of life, property, religion, mind, honor, and family. They all shared these rights, and from this perspective, there is no contradiction between the philosophy or the normative system behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rights given to Ademiyya in Islamic law. These basic rights. So every religious community under the millet system was given autonomy to manage its internal affairs and also implement the private law, like inheritance, marriage, within that community. And in the Ottoman Empire, these religious communities, they were represented in front of the state by milletbaşı, head of the millet, and they even collected taxes from their own communities as representative of the state. But during the period of modernization, millet system was abolished and universal citizenship was introduced. And this was also a process of secularization. So religious identity was completely disregarded. So whether you are Christian, Jew, Armenian, we don't care. You are Turkish citizen. See what I mean? So with the introduction of universal citizenship, millet system was abolished everywhere in the Muslim world. So millet as a group was a mediator between state and the individual. In the new secularized system, there was state and the individual, no mediator group between the two. And I have an article on this issue, from Zimmi to citizen.
Yeah.
Under the traditional millet system, non-Muslims, they were called Zimmi, but under the modern nation states, everyone was called citizen. And this process started after the Tanzimat era. But as I have mentioned, even some of the members of those millet groups resisted and objected against this process. But this was kind of irresistible, universal trend everywhere. Like almost all countries, adopted this universal citizenship, and it was accepted by Turkey and as well as other countries with Muslim majority populations. But officially, religious identity is disregarded, ignored. Like we are all Turks, we are all Syrians, we are all Arabs. Religion does not matter, but religion is a reality. I mean, whether you accept it or not, it's there. See what I mean?
Dr. Finn, actually, this discussion and the question helped to lay the groundwork for a future webinar that we'll be doing specifically on this question, because it's very interesting that many scholars have argued that that this transition from group identity rules to individualist citizenship-based rules has actually ironically had a negative impact on the rights of groups. Although individuals may have individuals may have rights, but this disregards the rights of groups, and that this actually has had in many ways a negative effect. And so there
Yeah, also
are there's now a movement among
the part of civil society also.
Yes.
You know, I mean, in this process, civil society groups were also eliminated.
Exactly. Fascinating discussion. You've really, what we really wanted to do with this session was to lay this foundational groundwork for future webinars, and you've really done that. So we're so blessed and grateful that you were with us today to share your wisdom. Jeremy, do you want to close us out, or?
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Shenturk, and
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Really fundamental principles and historical perspective that were laid, and we'll be sure to include some links to some of the articles that you mentioned, some of the papers you've done on concepts of Adamiyya, on some of these other.
Circle of Justice, we'll have that as well, the article that you wrote on that.
Yep. So thank you very much, and for joining us, Osman, as well. Thank you always for your insightful questions and contributions to the discussion.
I hope we're all reunited in Sarajevo in October when our
inshallah. I miss Sarajevo. I like it.
Fascinating conference a few years ago with Professor Bekir Kalia on civilization rivers westward. That was this is supposed to be in the same venue. Hopefully everything will work out later on.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ismail. Thank you, Professor. Great to be there.
Yeah, definitely. And continue to watch the Religious Freedom Institute website at rfi.org for more resources on these and other topics. So thank you all, and see you next time.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
Alaikum salam. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.